Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our discussion this morning, Interfaith and Pride, LGBTQ and BIPOC inclusion in faith spaces. We're so excited to welcome you all today. This conversation is in partnership with the Interfaith Center of New York, and I'd like to ask our colleague, Henry Goldschmidt from the Interfaith Center to offer a brief welcome.
Oh, thanks, Alexis. Just very briefly to say that from the Interfaith Center of New York, we're delighted to be working with Interfaith America on this program. It's an exciting month with Pride and yesterday with Juneteenth. And it feels great to be here with you all to celebrate it and to address some challenging issues. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Henry. As Henry just mentioned, this webinar came about through a conversation between the Interfaith Center and Interfaith America about how important it is to explore the challenges and opportunities that our present moment offers to interfaith leaders as it relates to supporting the work of liberation in our communities. So we chose to have this conversation today as we've all just come off of celebrating Juneteenth, which is one of the many days, actually, in which African Americans commemorate emancipation from slavery in the US, but also Pride Month, which is in June to honor the 1969 Stonewall riots and the struggle for justice and recognition of LGBTQ folks everywhere. So we are honored to have a truly amazing group of panelists to lead us through today's discussion. Before we introduce them and before I move into our sort of Zoom logistics, I do want to take a moment just to say that some aspects of our discussion will involve sensitive material, such as suicide and suicide ideation. So please take care of yourselves as you need to. If you need to take a break and come back, everyone at the conclusion of this webinar will receive a link to the full conversation. So with that, just want to share a couple of reminders about how to interact with our panel during this conversation. If you need captions, there is a CC button at the bottom of your screen, and you can select your captions and adjust them as you need to. You can also view messages from Interfaith America and read the full bios of each of our panelists in the chat feature. So any questions that you have, you can enter those through the chat throughout our conversation. And as I just said, at the conclusion of this, you will receive a link to the full conversation in your inbox within the next few days. And with that, I would like to turn it back over to Henry to introduce our panel.
Thanks, Alexis. And I would like to invite our panelists to turn on their cameras to join the conversation. Hi, it's lovely to see all of you. I'm really looking forward to talking with you this morning. But before we really kind of dive into the conversation, I just want to go around the Zoom room quickly and ask you all to introduce yourselves very briefly. As Alexis mentioned, we're also going to put your written bios in the chat so folks can read more about each of your work and your background, but we don't want to take the time to recite all those to people today. So instead, we'd like to ask you each to introduce yourselves. If you can give us or give the audience your name, of course, your pronouns if you'd like to share them, your organization or organizations that you work with, and your role in that work. And then, if you have worked with Interfaith America or the Interfaith Center of New York in the past, maybe share a bit of that history, which to kind of help set the stage. And then most important and most substantive, but very briefly, if you could just respond quickly to the question, what does freedom mean to you? Based on your own life experience, on your social justice work, on your faith perspectives, or any combination of the above, what does it mean to be free? So a deep question with very brief answers to get started. Let me turn first to Lama Rod Owens. Lama Rod, thanks so much for joining us. You
Thank
could
you.
introduce yourself and what does it mean to be free?
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. And special thanks to the organizations for sponsoring this important dialogue. My name is Lama Rod. I use he, him pronouns. I'm living and teaching on the ancestral lands of the Muskogee, Creek, and Cherokee people in a city we call Atlanta, or the ATL or Hotlanta, whichever decade you want to reference. And I am a Lama, which means Tibetan Buddhist teacher. My tradition of practice is Tantric Buddhism, and my work is really around the intersections of identity, spiritual practice, and justice. You know, how do we get free and also have a really deep, engaging spiritual practice? And in terms of freedom, right, you know, for me, freedom is having, you know, access to all the resources that I need to be happy, to be safe, right? To have everything that I need to experience health, to have a deep belonging to community, and to essentially experience happiness, you know, and living in the world, you know, having agency to do what I need to do in order to take care of myself and those around me. Freedom is about agency for me. And that's social freedom, right? For me, it's having this agency to have the resources I need to be well and for my community to be well. But ultimately, freedom is really about remembering who I am, like remembering that I am an expression of the divine, of something sacred. In certain language, we may call it an expression of God. In my tradition, we say that we are Buddhists, which means that we are expressions of emptiness and space and energy, you know, which for me is the heart of authentic love and care as well. So I'm trying to do both. I'm trying to establish or to embody social freedom as I am also embodying ultimate freedom as well, and to do those together in the world.
Thank you, Lama Rod. I really appreciate it. I appreciate all the different levels of freedom that kind of intersect with each other. Let me turn now, again, just very briefly from everyone to Reverend Don Abram. Reverend Don, if I may, can you introduce yourself, a little bit about your background, and what does freedom mean to you?
I'd be delighted to. First and foremost, let me express my sheer elation and gratitude to be on the call with each and every one of you. My name is Reverend Don Abram. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the founder and executive director of an organization called Pride in the Pews. And I am delighted to say that I was a colleague of some of the folks on this call as a program manager at Interfaith America. And I am still in partnership with the organization as we work to advance LGBTQ+ inclusion in different ways. And I'd say when I thought of the question, particularly around freedom, the first thing that came to mind for me was a song by Nina Simone entitled, "I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free." And there's this phenomenal line in it where she says, "I would soar to the sky and look down at the sea." And that just moves me because freedom ultimately is the ability to embody the fullness of who I am without apology, without restriction, and the ability, as Lama Rod said, to move in the world with complete unadulterated autonomy, deciding how I pursue joy, happiness, community, and doing so with the support, right, of those whom I am walking this earth alongside. That's what it means to be free for me.
Thank you, Reverend Don. I appreciate it. Let me turn next to Alan Morris. Alan, again, if you could just introduce yourself briefly, and what do you feel it means to be free?
Thank you all. It's really exciting to be here. Again, my name is Alan Morris. My pronouns are he, his, gladiator. I am the policy director for the LGBTQ task force. I am excited to be part of the interfaith family now. I'm plenty of colleagues that have spoken so highly of this org. I'm really happy to be here and establishing my own relationship with you all. What does freedom mean to me? Freedom is liberation. Freedom is Black trans women being able to walk down the street and not have their lives taken from them for no reason. Freedom is immigration being a Black issue and people actually valuing that, right? Freedom is also the level to be able to walk into a religious space and be yourself wholeheartedly without somebody trying to throw certain things at you that may not align with what you see as fruit, right? And so I think that freedom is being able to navigate so many different spaces and being able to stomp on the level of white privilege and white supremacy in so many different, spaces. And until we're able to actually get to that point, we will continue to scream, how can we be free? But I also want everyone to understand that none of us are free unless all of us are free. And when we think of that and when we see that, we have to see everyone as our neighbor. We have to see everyone as a loved one, and we have to move with intention and be agent of change.
Thank you, Alan. I appreciate it. Let me turn next to Tahil Sharma, who I think of all the panelists is joining us from furthest away, I believe in Rwanda. So fingers crossed for your internet connection, and if you could introduce yourself briefly and reflect a bit on freedom.
Thank you so much, Henry, and thank you everyone for this opportunity. I'm Tahil Sharma. My pronouns are he and him. I work as the regional coordinator for North America at the United Religions Initiative and serve as a board member for Sadhana, a coalition of progressive Hindus. And my definition of freedom is one, being unapologetically intersectional, which means if not all of me is free, then I am not free at all, as a part of this larger conversation about collective liberation. And the second is also to realize that if I am going to live my life in fear of hurting other people's sentiments because they do not know who I am, then I cannot be genuinely free. This conversation that we're having about freedom is really about not trying to hurt people's sentiments, but that their sentiments do not get to be expressed at the cost of my life and my livelihood.
Thank you. Thank you. And last but surely not least, let me turn to Tanisha Jarvis.
All right. Happy Pride, everyone. My name is Tanisha Esperanza. I go by she, her. I am a suicidologist and a neurodivergent adult consultant. And I am also a Black Leadership Fellow. And so for me, freedom is the ability to express and to kind of live your existence without the limitations of oppression.
Awesome. Thank you. That was, I think, our most succinct answer to freedom, but also deep. And I love right away that all of your reflections on freedom, none of you see freedom as something that just happens like independently, like we can all just go be free by ourselves without the rest of society. Freedom and interdependence are related. Freedom and structural change are related. So I love seeing those themes already. Let me now turn this back over to Alexis, and she and I have some specific questions for our different panelists.
Great, thank you, Henry, and thank you to all of you. I'm going to invite my dear colleague, Reverend Don, to sort of set the stage for us. So, this conversation comes out of the fact that a lot of harm has been done to LGBTQ folks, and especially LGBTQ folks of color in faith communities broadly defined. So not only congregations or institutional religious spaces, but religious schools, other religious communities. So with that history, I wanted to know if you could sort of just share what you think the harm has been done and what you think that maybe can be done to start us on a healing journey, especially what led you to create pride in the pews?
Thank you so much for the question. I think there are a couple of things I want to lift up as it relates to the state of play with regard to the LGBTQ plus community. First and foremost, in 2023 alone, there's been over 650 anti-LGBTQ plus bills introduced in state legislatures across the country. 650. We are only 6 months in. And so the fervor and tenacity with which folk are marginalizing, stripping the rights away from, silencing LGBTQ plus folk is increasing. And as that is happening, we are still on track to experience the deadliest year for Black trans women on record. All of this is happening, right, as we are actively engaged in institutions and in relationship with individuals who question the legitimacy of our humanity and who believe that somehow, right, our sexuality, our queerness, our transness, right, is not of God. And so one phenomenon that I think is important to lift up is the marginalization, the otherization, and the dehumanization of LGBTQ plus folk through the weaponization of sacred text and ritual and scripture. We have to acknowledge that the bills that we are seeing, the rhetoric that is being lifted up, is not separate and apart from faith traditions, which some have claimed and adopted as their own and has used as unilateral, they have used it as unilateral authority to other queer and trans folks. And for me, the thing that undergirds it is a sort of woeful underappreciation for the creativity, for the creation of God's humanity, but also an underappreciation for the complexity of God's humanity and creativity. And so for me, as I think about ways to fix this problem, right, I think we have to sit in conversation and in community with one another and hold space for the harm that has been done. I am a part of a Christian faith tradition which says that if we confess our sins, God is faithful and just to forgive us. And so before we can even think about healing these broken relationships, we first have to acknowledge the harm that has been done. But second, I also come from a faith tradition which says that we overcome by the blood of the Lamb, but also the word of our testimony. So we not only need to acknowledge the harm that has been done, we have to hold space for those who have been harmed, hold space for the sacred act and ritual of storytelling. And then lastly, we have to commit to actually hearing those stories and learning from them as guides for what comes next. And so for me, that was the impetus behind Pride in the Pews, the inspiration behind Pride in the Pews. How do we build relationship across lines of differences? And how do we make sure that as we are building a relationship, we are not asking folk to compromise the fullness of their humanity to do so? And so that's ultimately the work. And I do think that's the path forward, at least one of them.
Thank you, Don. I think that so many of us are really stuck on that statistic, like 650 pieces of legislation. And you're right, we're only midway through 2023. Alan, I want to turn to you now to sort of pick up on that as our policy person on the call. It seems also right now in all this legislation that the trans community is being specifically targeted. How do you understand both the challenges and opportunities that this moment offers to people of faith and faith communities?
Thank you. I think the larger question is, how do we build synergy to bring people to DC to confront and to approach this conversation with the knowledge that we have? You know, there's so many states that are passing gender affirming care bans, any sort of anti-LGBTQ legislation. But something that I'm seeing even in my current conversations, there's a bill that's being introduced tomorrow, which is called the Equality Act, and there's low energy. We are on the cusp of so many different resources out there that are hateful, but yet we can't even build the synergy on the Hill to say, have this bill, bring it to the floor and make it a bill, right? And something that I want to educate people on is that there's a difference between a marker bill and then a must-pass bill. A marker bill is something that they're just going to introduce to check a box to say, oh, okay, cool. Similar to, the Floyd policing. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee introduced this bill, but it was hard to get synergy to pass it. Yet when there was a high level of anti-Asian hate, that bill was passed within 60 days. So when we look at the level of synergy, the situations that are happening for trans, siblings, and just for individuals within this space that need protection, we need as many faith-based leaders that are willing to sacrifice themselves to come into DC and let's meet. Who do we need to reach out to? Whose offices do we need to be down there next? Because right now, they're telling us that they don't necessarily care. So when I say that they don't necessarily care, it's not that they don't want to. It's because Congress is divided. There's so many different things happening. There's so many different levels to how can we bring a bill to the floor and actually have it passed. When Republicans and Democrats have such a, keen sense on separating things, right? So we need faith-based leaders to come in and say, it doesn't matter the difference. The faith-based approach is we need to humanize everyone. And all communities intersect in so many different ways. So how can we come together to fix that problem without saying, well, fortunately, we're going to have to wait until the next Congress. We can do things now. And furthermore, we also need faith-based leaders reaching out to Joseph Robinette Biden. We need him to say, Congress, pass this bill. If you pass this bill today, I will. We need him speaking out, and standing up. Thank you for holding a press conference. Thank you for holding a Pride event. People are dying live. And the only way that we can get through that is building synergy, and also not just with faith-based boards, but we need civil, organizations that are looking at civil rights and minority, people issues. We need those people to come to our, table and say, how can we? So we need to build a space that is so much more broader than just saying, I can only rely on this person. We have to see this issue as a neighbor's issue, and we have to say, how can we?
Thank you, Alan. I appreciate it. I want to turn now to Lama Rod. And I hope that this is going to work well in the kind of arc of the conversation, because I feel like, Reverend Don kind of started us out by outlining some of the really horrific attacks on LGBTQ plus folks and people of color. And then Alan just kind of outlined some of the essentials about like a policy response, like what do we need to do in DC on a policy level to make change. But Lama Rod, I want to ask you, I guess on a more ethical or spiritual level, about the nature of our response to these issues. Specifically, I want to ask you about anger. You wrote a book called Love and Rage, The Path of Liberation Through Anger, which I have to admit kind of messes with my preconceptions or maybe just stereotypes of Buddhist teachers. The Buddhists are like calm and gentle, quote unquote Zen all the time, like anger is a negative emotion. So I'm wondering, reflecting on your book and other aspects of your work, how do you see the place of anger in social justice struggles, in responding to the issues that have laid out? And also, what do you see as the place of anger in your Buddhist practice?
Well, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. And I just want to start off by saying that, like, I'm just like pissed off. Like, I've been pissed off. I was born pissed off. The anger drove me into activism and service early on. I have always, since I can remember, been a student of Black justice and Black liberation work and the Black prophetic tradition. right? And I grew up in that. You know, I come from a small Southern community, and we fought, you know, and my mother is a minister, and her work has been around liberation and freedom, you know? And I completely understand when people, you know, they think about Buddhists, you know, we think about meek and mild, and those aren't the Buddhists that I know. So, you know, first and foremost. But yes, there is this belief in certain schools of Buddhism that anger has no place, right? And my school of Buddhism, and we have to understand too, before I continue, there are Buddhisms, you know, so there's just like, you just can't compare all the schools and lineages, you know. But in my tradition of Buddhism and Tantric Buddhism, anger is incredibly important because it actually helps us to understand that there is imbalance. There's something that needs to be addressed, right? Ultimately, for me, it helps me to understand that I have been hurt, that I am in the process of being hurt, that people around me are in the process of being hurt. And my anger is making sure that I draw my attention to that hurt, right? Because for me, the hurt is where I do my work from, not the anger. The anger is energy that I'm relying on, right? It's showing me what to do. It's showing me how to get focused, but it's the heartbreak, the suffering, right? Which is what I'm using to really move through the world and do the work of justice, because it helps me to understand that I'm not the only person who's hurt, who's afraid, who's suffering, who is afraid of being killed and murdered. Like, I'm not the only person in the world, right? And we're all suffering in certain ways, especially the people who are doing, you know, the most to silence and erase us. You know, the politicians, you know, these advocates who are actually behind all of these bills and legislation, right? It's like this deep fear and deep pain that they're not taking care of. So they're weaponizing it against us, right? Because we're mirrors reflecting back to them what it means and what it looks like to be free, right? And this kind of freedom takes responsibility. It's work, right? And so instead of doing the work to experience freedom, right, I'm just going to like actually forget about the potential of me being free, and then just erase and silence all those people who are reminding me of what freedom really looks like, right? And that's what, for me, being Black and queer is really rooted in. Like, I am a mirror reflecting back to the world what it has meant for me and my people to actually choose joy, right? In the face of like deep annihilation, right? To live and move through the world, not just wanting Black folks and queer folks and trans folks to be free, but wanting everyone to be free. Like, Black liberation is about everyone getting free, not just Black folks, right? You know, and my anger is what's underneath all of this. Like, you feel that energy, right? But when I talk about love and rage, right, my love, which is my belief, my dedication to want people to have access to the resources that they need to be well, and to have the agency to choose, like, how to be free, right? That's my basic love, right? And that love is also taking care of my anger. That love is actually keeping me from reacting to anger in such a way that I create more harm and violence by reacting to it, right? So holding that energy and learning how to channel it with the help of love into the work of freedom and liberation for not just our communities, but everyone.
Yeah, thank you. So to tie it back in some ways to other schools of Buddhist thought about anger, it sounds like, you know, you in your work and in your you know, spirituality, you embrace anger as a source of energy and as a tool, but not so much as an end in itself. You know, not as not the ultimate goal. The goal is joy, liberation, but anger can help us get there. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's early Buddhism, just to be clear for those of us, you know, on the call. Early Buddhism says, let's avoid it and let's put it away. My school of Buddhism, Tantric Buddhism, which is, you know, rooted in Southeast Asia, Tibet, Ladakh, and so forth, is really about like, how do you actually lean into not just anger, but everything that we run away from, right? How do we use the poison to actually, how do we transform the poison into medicine,
Yeah.
That's
thank
the
you.
path that I'm working with. Mhm.
That's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm struck by what you said, Lama Rod, about responsibility and the fact that just the work of freedom, even just being free as ourselves, requires constant vigilance and real work. And it's really the responsibility of all of us to ensure that for our communities. But it is work in addition to, the work that we do in other facets of our life. And Tanisha, I just wanted to ask you, in your work, to kind of tell us where we are right now. What is it like for folks who are really struggling to do this work? What are the implications of marginalization and exclusion in our communities today? What does that look like?
Yeah. It's a real struggle. And I say that because we're looking at a culmination of the social historical mix of trauma and pain and all of that coming together today. And so what that looks like is we can look at the statistics and the facts that we see, especially for Black and queer youth. Suicide is a uptick in a huge trend. And so we're looking at Black kids from the ages of 5 to 12 have the highest risks of suicide and have the highest suicide deaths across age. So that means that across any type of age, whether elders or youngers, they have the highest rate of suicide, even amongst white or Latinx or other kind of like children. And so then we also look at trans youth, and we look at LGBTQ youth have high suicide rates. And that is also in combination with, homelessness. And that's also in combination with bullying. And so we're looking at these trends, and we're looking at individuals who are the most marginalized, kind of like having to deal with the side effects of marginalization and white supremacy. And it's depressing. It is depressing. But I think once you have the facts, what's really helpful and what's really amazing to see is like looking at risk factors. So when, for example, we're looking at transgender youth, a lot of times the risk factors is lack of community, or having a community where my identity is not accepted. And so who I am is not accepted. And so there's this internal kind of like pressure and this external battle between I'm not acceptable, right? And there comes that hopelessness, which is a huge risk factor of suicide. And so when we're looking at religious spaces and when we're looking at community in general, what are like protective factors against suicide for people is having a community where there's acceptance, there's awareness, because suicide is not this thing of like, it's happening right now in the moment and it's just random. It's actually a buildup. And so you often have to look at some risk factors. There's mental health going on. Again, there's houselessness. So looking at people who are kind of like on the fringe of society. And so how do we as a community come together, which is acceptance, and how do we come together in loving each other? And so I think when we talk about suicide prevention, it's really important to understand that community is not just about individualism or like church, right? Community is about how us together as a group can kind of destabilize the systems that we have in place, because we even have mental health experts who are not aware of suicide risk for people of color or for transgender youth. And some mental health providers don't even give a crap about it. And so we have to provide that space and have people like us who are queer, who are neurodivergent, who are in these spaces and who are creating kind of community.
Thank you, Tanisha. I want to turn last to Tahil. And I don't want to, I hope to end this portion of our conversation on a note of hope and optimism. We're looking at challenging stuff. And again, especially with the statistic that Tanisha just shared, about the prevalence of suicidality for like the youngest Black kids. It's just, it's as a parent, for me, it's horrifying to hear that. So it's some dark stuff, some challenging stuff that we're looking at. But Tahil, I'm wondering, how do you think the interfaith movement in general, organizations like Interfaith America, the Interfaith Center of New York, and United Religions Initiative, how can we respond to the issues that we've explored today? What are interfaith organizations already doing to support LGBTQ folks and people of color? And what more could they do or should they do? And then I guess maybe it's maybe a little abstract way to put it, but I think more fundamentally, how can interfaith ties create a space for people to be freer in their religious identities, racial identities, sexual identities, whatever else, just as human beings? How can interfaith work create a space for freedom? And as an interfaith organizer, where do you see hope? Sorry, that was like a whole bunch of different questions piled together, but I hope they speak to each other. Tahil.
Thank you. As I'm thinking about all of the questions through the time zones, I'm able to process, so it's okay. First, I want to honestly say that if interfaith communities want to actually take some responsibility, they will have to admit that up to this point, the interfaith movement has failed LGBTQ people, period. If they're not going to admit to excluding us, to dehumanizing us, and to not being a part of the solution, then they first have to take responsibility for being the bystanders and not the upstanders that they should be. It's a fundamental part of how our modern history of the interfaith movement since the Parliament of the World's Religions in the 1890s has come to prove that in 130 years of history, LGBTQ people still cannot speak up in an interfaith space. And that is a disgusting thing to think about, especially when we come into this space with pride, being unapologetic, and being able to still do interfaith work as LGBTQ people. If interfaith organizations want to take any responsibility for that, they first have to apologize and admit to doing better. And I think for us, in thinking about how these spaces can really be built, we have to really think about interfaith spaces as being intersectional. If we are expected to leave any part of our identity at the door, we're not genuinely doing interfaith cooperation work. We're just putting up a facade that says we are not fully accepted for who we are, but we can really engage in this thing we call peace building. We can really engage in this thing called building a better world. And that's just pathetic to think that people would like to do that without including the whole person in the room. For the amount of time that I've been doing this work, which comparatively to others is quite limited, I've come to understand that, especially in North America, as I work in the United States and Canada, this idea of being able to center LGBTQ identities or experiences as being an interfaith issue is kind of where all of this starts. Because this idea that LGBTQ people can be religious or spiritual, let alone wanting to commit to a better world, is something that goes above a lot of people's heads. So the ability to say that I am a person that identifies as bisexual, while also being someone that practices two different faith traditions, is just unfathomable to a lot of people in the room because they don't understand the concept of intersectionality. And that's kind of the place where we need to start in trying to improve conditions within an interfaith space to actually make it more radically inclusive and actually mean it. I have been in spaces where even at an organization like the United Religions Initiative, to Interfaith America, to the Parliament of the World's Religions, and many others that are more grassroots and city-oriented, that have plenty of queer people. But when you ask them the question about how they feel as individuals participating, they feel welcomed. But then when you ask them, how does it feel to be centered as a queer person in interfaith work, they tell me, we've never been asked this question before. And that's the root of how you think of best accommodating LGBTQ people in an interfaith space. What do they need? It's not just about calling them by the right pronoun or the right name. It's not just about putting out a progress or an LGBTQ pride flag during the month of June. is actually reaching out to them and asking, what do you need? Where can we best support you? How do we make sure that we can be as unapologetic as allies to show up for you when things really hit the fan? And I think ultimately a big part of this too is actually educating people that the history of religion is also the history of queerness. There is no separation between those things because many great traditions have fundamental queer aspects that allow the tradition to come to fruition. As a Hindu, personally speaking, getting to know that there are deities, there are scriptures that mandate our acceptance of being, fully feminine and fully masculine at the same time, while having deities that show gender fluidity, transness, and so many other things, tells me that my history actually goes centuries, if not millennia, further than this reality of Stonewall being a riot. Stonewall had to be a riot for equity, but my history did not start there. My history started centuries, if not thousands of years earlier. So do not limit me and my practice and my expression to just be, oh, this is a thing from the last 50 years. No, my community is older than your fundamental reality of religion, your institutional religion. And for us to be able to educate about those things is so important, because I did not know that I could be bisexual and Hindu and Sikh until I found out myself. My own traditions, my own communities repressed me from being accepted, from being equal. And that's where reclamation really is helpful on the interfaith education aspect and how it intersects with other identities. And that's where a thriving interfaith space can really come to fruition.
Thank you, Tahil. I really appreciate both sides of that answer, both pointing out the really positive resources that are there in the interfaith movement and in interfaith spaces, and also pointing out the reality of how interfaith spaces can be spaces of exclusion for queer folks, for people of color. So thank you. If I could follow up, I don't know if this is too personal, but you said a moment ago that it came as a revelation to you that you could be bisexual and Hindu and Sikh, and none of these things are exclusive of each other. Can you say a little bit more, just on a personal level, about that moment in your growth and development? Did that come out of your interfaith work in some way, or what led you to that expression of freedom in your own faith and sexual identities?
Yeah, so I would certainly say that through most of my childhood and adult life, I had a lot of confusion about being LGBTQ, and if I even identified. Although I was surrounded by a parental space that was affirming of LGBTQ people, I couldn't really figure out if my deep spiritual connection with Hinduism and Sikhism was running counter to this possibility that I could be bisexual, that I could be gay, that I could be thinking differently about the way that I have a relationship between sexuality and how I identify as a religious person. Well, it actually started when I started doing interfaith work and was thinking about, well, how is it that I'm able to do this work, but I can't be my entire self? So I kind of looked to my scriptures, I looked to my traditions, I looked at their histories, and I particularly looked at the baggage of just traditional gender roles and patriarchy and what informs those things. We obviously look at things like white supremacy and colonialism and the impact that that's had. We want to give it enough credit, but we don't want to give it all the credit, because some of these traditions do hold patriarchal tendencies without just the idea of the notion that colonialism and white supremacy are the only things that made them that way. Sometimes kinfolk are not kinfolk, and we don't support ourselves in our own communities in a lot of ways. But it also made me think about how, if I am looking at my traditions, if I'm looking at my community and seeing how misogynistic it can be, how traditional it can be in its gender roles, is that informed by scripture itself, or are there choices being made to say that this should be the norm? And this is when I started having to have a deep dive of my traditions. In Sikhism, I'm looking at this text that is telling me that God is universal, that God exists in all things, that we have to be unapologetic about justice and service, and there's no excuse outside of that. So great. I have an objective way of understanding and saying, I can be unapologetically Sikh and unapologetically bisexual. Great. Hinduism having a history with things related to caste, related to gender roles, related to these things that tell me, oh, I cannot actually be Hindu and queer. But wait, why are there these stories of different gods and goddesses that are gender fluid? Why are there these stories of communities that are telling me, oh, we can be queer and we've been Hindu for hundreds, if not thousands of years? Oh, why am I now learning that these same communities have actually practiced interfaith services? I just learned this year. This is one of my favorite things. There is a caravan of Hindus and Muslims that travel from different states in India that go to this special Sufi shrine to honor a saint there. And they go put a special sort of, I don't want to call it a blanket, but like a special covering for the mausoleum that is especially brought in by transgender people who are Hindu and Muslim. And that the idea that tradition has been going on for centuries, led by transgender caravans of people from around the country, was such an affirming way to say, oh my God, this is my tradition. I have been Hindu and Sikh this whole time, and that's meant that I can be bisexual. My religion helped me to come out.
Yeah, thank you, Tahil. Appreciate it. Alexis, I want to turn back to you, and I don't know if we have questions from participants in the chat or.
Yes, we have
okay,
a couple of questions that have come in. I encourage folks with the couple minutes we have left, if you want to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to add a question, feel free. But a large amount of our audience today is sort of coming from spaces of higher education. So I'm going to sort of try to synthesize some of their questions. But if we see in a college or university as an institution which is designed to serve a diverse public, some of our audience have been asking about if there's like an interfaith center or multicultural center on campus, how do you hold space and sort of support LGBTQ folks while also recognizing that other folks that you may serve, their tradition or the way they interpret their tradition may not accept that or may not accept that identity. So I know that we've talked about how there are multiple Buddhisms, there are multiple Christianities, there's multiple ways of sort of interpreting text and sort of seeing our religious traditions embodied. How would you recommend that folks who have to serve everyone sort of hold space for everyone? And anyone can answer this question, or if you have any thoughts.
Well, I can just offer something just really briefly in terms of, it's deeply related to the work of chaplaincy, right? As a chaplain, all we do is hold space, which means that like I recognize and notice what's happening, how people are showing up, and I don't react. I just say, you know what, here you are, right? Because my role in terms of spiritual guidance is just to offer a non-judgmental presence when we're doing the work of like spiritual direction. Like I'm not trying to get you to think differently. I'm trying to show up to hold space for you so you start experiencing the space that allows you to start thinking more critically, more deeply about the choices you're making. But I do believe that like as spiritual leaders, like we have to model, not just talk a good game, but like show up embodied to like really demonstrate what it means to express compassion, to express deep love, but also to be clear about who and what we are at the same time.
I'll hop in here and say that queer and trans folk have been othered so much so that our humanity is not seen as legitimate, and therefore our needs are not seen as legitimate. And so when the expression of those needs meet consternation, I think there's a tendency for institutions to then remain silent or to stay away from the issue. But what I have found in my work is that often resistance or rejection of queer and trans folk, it's often rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of who we are, and just lack of acknowledgement of the fact that we have shared experiences, we have shared humanity, and there are ways in which through conversation, right, and in hearing our stories, right, you can actually acknowledge that even though we may disagree ideologically, we can acknowledge that we do have shared humanity. And so as we think about what it means for us to thrive on campus, to thrive in the classroom, to hold space for the diversity of our lived experience, that means acknowledging that we have different needs, and that means acknowledging that there is harm being done for certain communities in certain ways. And so what does it look like to hold space, to Lama Rod's point, for all of us, right? For all of our concerns, for all of our humanity. But when the very existence of queer and trans folk is controversial, it's difficult to even get to that place.
I agree. I think it is difficult for a lot of institutions to get to that place. And, you know, silence is felt, it's deeply felt. But I do know that hope and inspiration can be born out of those silences, and that new creative communities can be formed. So I just sort of, as we close, just sort of want to go around to each of you and ask, where are you finding hope and inspiration right now? Yeah, I'll just leave it sort of open-ended like that. Where are you finding hope and inspiration?
I'll jump in here. I'm finding hope from our young people. Our young people, these Gen Zers, like, they are not playing. They are speaking up. They are speaking out, and they are doing the work to ensure that their needs are being seen, but not just seen, but they're being valued in so many different ways. So just reaching out to ensure that they know that they have the support, and that we have larger, organizations like, Interfaith and, other places, to know that we will have your back. I think that that's something that they need to hear, and it's something that they also need to see with action.
Thank you. Anyone else briefly? Where do you see hope in this moment for LGBTQ plus folks, for people of color, for all of our freedom and liberation?
I'll go. I think for me, I'm definitely on a personal level, late diagnosed autistic. And so unmasking, which is very similar to LGBTQ folks in the sense of finding who you are authentically in the world. And that means finding autistic joy, which means your inner child, and finding where there is joy and celebration and dance and movement. And it's my connection to my ancestors and my community. It makes me feel hopeful about life.
Awesome. Thank you, Tanisha. I love how often the word joy has come up in this conversation, despite all the challenging stuff we're addressing.
I am finding hope in the work that I'm doing. I'd love to share this quick anecdote. I was training a church here in Chicago, in the city of Evanston, Illinois. And it was an all-Black congregation, old school, hand clapping, toe tapping Black church. They had never had conversations around LGBTQ plus inclusion. And we were conducting the training, my colleague and I, and about halfway through, a deacon, the president of the deacon board actually, decided to raise his hand and said, I have a question for you. It might be a bit off topic, but can you tell me what a bear is? Now, I'm conflicted and confounded and perplexed because I'm trying to understand why this deacon is asking me what a bear is. Now, for those of you who don't know, a bear is a sort of tribe in the LGBTQ plus community. It is someone who is shaped in a particular way and has certain bodily characteristics. It is very unique. It's very particular, right? And this deacon raised his hand and asked that question And for me, it was hilarious because it's, how do you even know what that is? But two, right, his willingness to pose that question and to lean into curiosity about a community whom he does not know all that well, and to pose that question and curiosity in the midst of his peers and fellow colleagues suggests that there was growth, suggested in that moment that there is hope. And so for me, I do these trainings so that deacons can ask me what a bear is, or so deacons can ask me what a twink is, right? And I can offer that, right, seemingly superficial knowledge, right? But in doing so, we're actually building community with one another. And so I find hope in those little moments of levity and laughter.
Awesome. Thank you, Reverend. And I'm dying to know where that question was coming from. I'm thinking maybe his son identifies as bear or something, but thank you. Anyone else briefly on where you see hope in this moment?
Yeah, I would just say, just to echo, Alan, Tanisha, and even Don as well, just like there's so much hope in the young people, especially in our capacity to choose joy and our capacity to ask questions and to be curious. But mostly for me, hope is really rooted in my ancestors, because my ancestors made a way out of no way. I come from enslaved people, right? Displaced people, right? Or as I often say, displaced indigenous people, right? Who made it possible for me to be here, and many of us in this space to be here in this moment doing the work that we're choosing to do, right? And so if they made it, I can make it, right? So.
Thank you. Tahil, I think you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, just two quick things. Things that give me sort of hope and joy in this moment. One was an interfaith pride service that I got to host for the first time to sort of introduce us into Pride Month. And it was the ability to see the same pews where people pray to be the same pews where people were celebrating a drag show happening in a church. I think that was something that was really wonderful to see. And in getting to speak to the drag queen about their experience, they had talked about how in the same church that they may have gone to go pray, they didn't realize that that would be the same church where they would get to perform numbers. And they were so freaked out about the experience that we were just there to affirm them as religious communities, as religious leaders, to say, no, this is your space. This is where you get to thrive. I think it was just a wonderful thing. And I think secondly, it's this space where we're having this conversation right now. I think Interfaith America and ICNY getting to actually help to facilitate this conversation is a sigh of relief of saying, finally, we can talk about this in an interfaith space in this way. And what this can lead to as an example for other communities to follow, as not just an attempt to have a conversation, but to really think about the practical ways that queer, trans, BIPOC people can be supported.
Thank you, Tahil. Much appreciated.
As we close, I just want to say thank you all so much for this really rich conversation. Thank you to the panelists, but also thank you to our networks. I do want to say Tahil has been an emerging leader at Interfaith America for a long time, and so many folks in the network have really encouraged us to sort of lean into this space and say more and do more for LGBTQ inclusion in the interfaith movement. So I want to thank you all for just accompanying us on this journey and being a part of that. We hope that this is just the beginning of this conversation and that we can extend the work that we're doing together. I do want to say, just as a reminder, that everyone who registered for the conversation today will receive a link to the recording and a brief survey in the next couple of days. So if you could fill that out, we would be very appreciative. If you want to keep in touch with Interfaith America's racial equity work and with the Interfaith Center of New York, you can visit us at our websites. We have plenty of virtual opportunities coming up over the summer. And I just want to say very briefly, Interfaith America is very fortunate to be presenting at the Smithsonian's Folk Life Festival on June 30th. The theme this year is lived religions in the United States, and we have had a couple of our Black Interfaith Fellows like Tanisha, Jarvis, to help put that together. So we'd love to see you in Washington, D.C. if you are there, but if not, and you want to follow us on social media, we will be sharing updates from that event there. So again, thank you all for joining us. We appreciate you, and happy Pride. Take care, everyone.